Can we imagine how future battles will be fought today so that we can be ready for tomorrow's combat? We talked to John Antal about the battlefield disruptors that are changing the character of war.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 132 of the Principles of War podcast, 10 battlefield disruptors that are changing the character of war today. I'm very excited to have on the podcast today retired Colonel John Antal. He's the author of a range of books, including 7 Seconds to Die, the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, and Next War, Reimagining How We Fight. He spent 30 years in the US military as an armor and cavalry officer. He's a graduate of the US Military Academy at West Point, an airborne ranger. He's graduated from the US Army Command and General Staff College and the Army War College. And he's commanded combat units from platoon through to regiment. He's conducted intensive studies into some recent conflicts, including Second Nagorno-Karabakh, the Israeli conflicts, and, of course, the conflict in Ukraine. He studied what changes have been occurring on the battlefield. These changes are predominantly technology-related. These are nations that are fighting existential wars. There is a very fast pace of innovation and adaptation. The challenge for militaries that aren't decisively engaged in combat today is how can they observe the changes that are occurring on the battlefield, adapt the technology into their own militaries, and then develop the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are required to be able to wield these weapons on tomorrow's battlefield. We've got a lot of ground to cover. This is going to be the first of a 3-part series with John. He's done extensive research, extensive analysis, and he's been very generous with his time in sharing his findings. So let's get straight into it. So John, welcome to the podcast.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me on your show.
In your book, Next War, you describe 9 battlefield disruptors. What was the process that you've gone through to classify those disruptors?
What I had done is, with a long study of military history, ever since, I can remember being conscious, I've been studying military history. So putting all that together, West Point, 30 years in the U.S. Army, Command and General Staff College, War College, all those things, commanding units, being around the world and studying wars, I looked at the wars of the last few years. And I developed from those wars, the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, the 2021 Israeli-Hamas war, which is not the war that is happening now, but a war that only lasted 11 days. The neat thing about that war was, the important thing about that war was that was the first war in history primarily won by artificial intelligence. So to know that and to say, oh my gosh, look at that, how come we're not studying it, is really important. The Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, which happened in 2020, was the first war in history primarily won by robotic systems. So we should pay attention to that. And it was a 44-day decisive conflict, which ended in a decisive military victory. So we really should pay attention to that, because how many decisive military conflicts have you seen lately? And then the next one was, of course, the Russo-Ukrainian War, which is ongoing, and the most innovative and bloodiest war in Europe, in history, in the 21st century, history. Then the ongoing Israeli, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, Houthi fighting, which just recently has been curtailed and ended in a ceasefire between Israel and Iran, but the war in Hamas is still going on. So from that, I developed these 9 disruptors, and since the book was published, I now have 10. So I'm doing my best not to add any more, but I added one, and be happy to go through all of them with you, because I think those disruptors, although they are not principles of war, are things that every military professional and anybody who cares about the military sphere needs to understand how warfare has changed. Because the difference between 20th century war and 21st century war are these disruptors plus. So it's important to analyze what's going on, as the pace of change, is so rapid these days. We have to think and pause and take time to discuss this with like-minded folks so that we can understand how to move forward. Because the goal of all this study, and the whole point of talking about this, is for leaders to gain foresight. And foresight, I define as the ability to solve problems in the short term and create solutions for the long run. So solve problems in the short term and create solutions for the long run. This is the kind of leader I want to follow. It's the kind of leader most people want to follow. You've got to have the character. You've got to have the competence. You've got to have the commitment. But if you have that and foresight, you're an extraordinary leader. Being able to, as we say, look 2, 3 moves ahead, 4 moves ahead, 6 moves ahead, imagine. And in an era where AI, artificial intelligence, is speeding everything up dramatically, we really need leaders with foresight. AI can provide information. In some cases, it can provide some correlation of data that gives you some trends and gives you ideas, but it can't provide you foresight. Foresight is a very human concept. Now, maybe someday AI will give us foresight. In other words, be able to run enough calculations that it says your probability of success is 95%, or your probability of failure is 95%. And that's when you say, don't ever tell me the odds.
It's really interesting you mentioned that, because I think a fundamental part of the leadership is having that vision thing. And we need a vision of what the future battlefields are going to look like, because otherwise we're not going to be able to create a training program that's going to be in any way effective. And soldiers are going to be looking for someone who can say, this is where we need to be. We need to be skating to where the puck is going to be, not where it is today. So that's exciting. 10 battlefield disruptors. Let's start going through them then.
Okay, great. And I promise right now, but I might change my mind next week. But right now I say no more than 10, because, you have to stop somewhere. I initially said only 7, but, too many things were happening that made me think a little bit differently. So the first is the transparent battle space. The transparent battle space is obvious today if you study warfare and you see what's going on in any theater, anywhere, in any war, anywhere on the earth. Right now, there are so many sensors, if you want to put them there, and our peer enemies will want to do that. There are so many ways you can sense things and so many different ways to do it. You can sense in the optical, which means you can see things with the eyeball and all sort of aided things, but you see it. The next is, of course, you can see it in the thermal. So you have thermal imaging that can see things. You have electronic, so you can see anything that has electronic emission. You can see in the sense of acoustic by hearing where things are happening, the crack of the guns, the sound of the guns, and triangulating where that location is, and therefore knowing that location. And then lastly, there's the quantum, which is being worked on by all the major powers to develop quantum radars and quantum sensing systems, which are not yet there. They're very exotic, very expensive, and very few, but someday could be all over the place. But right now, what we have to do is understand that the battle space is transparent, and that you have to go to extraordinary efforts to mask your forces so the enemy can't see you. Now, we've been able to see this happen a couple of times in the wars of recent last 4 years. For instance, the Ukrainians were able to mask their counterattack, or their invasion of Russia in August and September of last year. Being able to mask that was a tremendous effort on their part, and brilliantly done. The United States was just recently able to deceive the Iranians as to how the bombers of the B-2 bombers that were striking the Iranian targets, the 3 nuclear reactor sites, or actually the bombers attacked just 2. But the idea of attacking those sites with using deception, basically masking your move, was very important. So in a battle space where everything can be seen, where the Chinese and the Russians and everyone else are looking with satellites, with balloons, with aircraft, and with drones and everything else, the battle space becomes very transparent, and you have to take extraordinary measures, as those 2 examples just explained, in order to hide and mask your forces. The next disruptor is the first strike advantage. And this one is particularly worrisome for us, because the United States and our friends, Australia and other allies, we're not going to attack China. We're not going to attack Russia. But if the Russians or the Chinese decide to attack us, or the North Koreans for that matter, they will attack with surprise, and they will not give us any warning. and we will have to receive their attack. The question that I ask military leaders all the time is that you recognize the possibility of a first strike advantage, don't you? And they say, yes, of course. Just like at Pearl Harbor, that could happen. And I said, how many of your war games start off with an enemy first strike? And of course, their answer is, oh, well, none of them. So what war are we getting ready for? What war are we trying to raise our ability to fight so that we can raise deterrence to the point that the enemy won't fight us because they know they won't win? We're not taking that into consideration. So the first strike advantage is something that could happen anytime in history. Any army could do a first strike. But today, with a transparent battle space and long-range precision fires, the first strike could be a war winner. So imagine if across the Pacific, the Chinese were able to launch a first strike and near simultaneously hit most of our targets with precision-guided weaponry while we are in a peacetime configuration without warning. And people say, well, that would never happen. We would always have warning. We would always know. And I will tell you that we have been surprised more often than not. And if you could start at Pearl Harbor, but you could go back farther. And the United States, for instance, at Pearl Harbor was at a peacetime configuration and did not think that the Japanese could reach Pearl Harbor. Never underestimate the enemy. And you just saw this month, Operation Spiderweb, where the Ukrainians attacked across the depth of Russia. And you saw the Israelis attack across the depth of Iran. And the United States reach deep into Iran and attack targets. So there's no place that is not able to be hit, sensed by sensors, and then hit by long-range precision fires if you want to move enough of your energy to do that. And so therefore, we have to be very concerned about an enemy first strike. And he who has the first strike advantage may have a war-winning advantage. So what do you think about those two?
I think it's the first strike advantage, I think, is a really difficult question to look at. I think it's really interesting that you asked the question about wargaming, because that sort of starts the framing of, like, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? And if we start from, the troops are all mobilized, the logistics is all primed, that's a very different scenario to we've just woken up this morning and we've all had a very bad day and now the war has started. So I think that's a really good question. And the transparent battlefield, obviously, you put those two together and it just means that it's going to be significantly worse than previous surprise attacks because of the fact that the enemy is going to have much better targeting information.
Right. As you know, in my book, Next War, I talked about a first strike by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor. And I started it off with a counterfactual. The counterfactual was simply this. Admiral Yamamoto is given an option by his head planner that says, after looking at how well our dive bombers and our torpedo planes have worked in the most recent training exercise, we only have a 38% hit rate. And that's true. And they knew that. So with only a 38% hit rate, we have to have multiple waves of attacks. So we can't attack them once or twice or three times. We have to attack them about 6 times in order to get to where we want. And that means we've got to get back off those carriers and keep going. And I don't think we can do that in this scenario. I don't think we can do that, he tells Yamamoto. But he says, but I know a way that we can have a much higher hit rate. And Yamamoto says, well, tell me, what is it? He says, well, our pilots should crash into the enemy boats. They should crash into the enemy ships. They should have so much explosives on their planes that they are flying bombs. They should kamikaze. Now, in 1941, the Japanese were not willing to do this. They were not at the point where they thought that kamikaze was the way they should fight. But by 1944, they were. And what that is a precision-guided, long-range precision fire weapon. So when you look at the transparent battle space, and you look at the first strike advantage, and you tie that in with long-range precision fires that we now know everyone can have. Ukraine has them. Azerbaijan against Armenia in the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War had them. There are elements in the Congo fighting, in other places in Africa that have drones that are precision-guided weaponry. So with all of that put together, the first strike advantage is a huge problem. For instance, if an enemy wanted to strike Australia, they know where all your bases are. They know where all your barracks are. Your tanks and vehicles are all lined up in motor pools. Americans the same way, all across the Pacific. Now, what we'd like to know is that the level of alert goes higher and higher to where we disperse and we're not in a peacetime configuration and the enemy can't strike us as well. The bottom line is that first strike advantage is so powerful that the enemy will do everything they can. They'll move heaven and earth in order to get that first strike advantage. So we have to be very, very cognizant of it. And if we're not doing it in our war games, when are we practicing for this? How are we thinking about this? And what this means is we have to be harder to kill. You see, right now we're very easy to kill. U.S. forces in Europe, for instance, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Germany, UK, all peacetime configurations. Now, the enemy may not have weapons that can range that far, that are not intercontinental ballistic missiles, but the Ukrainians just showed that semi-trucks are the aircraft carrier of the 21st century, where semi-trucks were used to launch drones. So imagine simultaneous drone, missile, aircraft attacks across many, many different peacetime configured areas. It could be very bad. So the first strike advantage is a huge disruptor, and we have to deal with it both mentally and with training. The next is artificial intelligence in the tempo of war. Artificial intelligence, as you know, is changing everything in our lives. It changes your life every day. And you say, how? Well, you no longer use a paper map to get from point A to point B. If you have to get somewhere and meet someone for lunch and you've never been to that place before, you put it into your GPS, you get point-by-point instructions. That's a very simple example of artificial intelligence speeding up the tempo of your life, being able to get there without having to do it as we used to in the old days. Now, you may not remember, but we used to have to get out a map and actually know where we were going. And in some cases, either write it down, the directions, or memorize them. Now you don't have to do that. Now you can be clueless and listen to your GPS and end up in the wrong place, miles away, because you were clueless. Or you can be informed and use your GPS to really speed you up and get to the right location. Point is, though, that AI speeds up everything in the civilian world, and it also will speed up and is speeding up everything in the military sphere. So we have weapon systems that have AI in them that allow them to do things that you couldn't do 10 years ago. And this will only increase, and this will make things go faster and faster. So the cognitive ability of human beings to understand this tempo is important for us to fathom and to figure out ways to help us. We need better decision aids. Now, throughout my time in the Army, I've been a developer of decision aids. For instance, I developed a thing called the combat ruler, which measures distance in time. Now you say, what? Well, it's very simple, but military leaders have to be able to think in terms of time, not just distance. So if the enemy is moving at 20 kilometers an hour, which is the usual attack speed for an armored formation that is unopposed by obstacles, and it's coming at you straight at 20 kilometers an hour, how many minutes does it take to go 1 kilometer? And if the young leader can't figure that out, then they can't figure out how long they can engage the enemy from different positions before they either have to move or they're overrun. So you have to fight by minutes. So it takes 3 minutes to move 1 kilometer at 20 kilometers an hour. And of course, you can change that speed and you can figure out different times. And infantry will advance more slowly and all that. Drones advance much quicker. Drones will advance at 40 to 60 kilometers an hour. So you're going to double that. So imagine if you detect them, you may have 5 minutes. At 18 kilometers, if you detect them, you may have only 5 minutes before they hit you. So what are your thought processes? What is your battle drill to defeat drone attack? So all of that AI is speeding up everything, and the tempo of war is going to be something we have to deal with from a human level and a decision maker's level. The next is top attack. Now, what do you think top attack is?
Well, I think it's what we've been seeing, which is the adaptation. So Ukraine at the start of the war, just dropping a hand grenade through the hatch of an armored vehicle, which is a great adaptation. Surfaces and gaps, literally just going to put a hand grenade, because a hand grenade against a tank isn't very effective unless, of course, you can put it inside the tank.
Yeah, exactly. Well done. I mean, the whole idea that we were very interested in building up the the armor of a tank, for instance, at the front and then the flanks, and not so much from the rear and not so much from the bottom, was because during the World War II and Cold War experiences, you kept your armor toward the enemy and you fought a two-dimensional battle space. Now, when air power comes in, you got a huge problem. And in 1944, for instance, the Wehrmacht had a huge problem against American air power and Allied air power, in France. And so therefore, they had to adapt very quickly. So what did they do? Well, they realized they had a transparent battle space. Whenever the weather was good, the Allies could fly and they could see everything and they would attack you immediately. And that was devastating to them. And we gained so much out of being able to fix their ability not to maneuver. They could not maneuver well. And when they did, taking them down. So they had to be excellent at camouflage or die, and they had to operate at night. And they became good at both of those things. So top attack has changed how warfare is being fought. We're no longer interested as much in the front and the flanks, although those are still important because you can still be attacked that way. And they can still blow you up from the bottom, which the last 20 years of fighting, in the war against terror, we basically made V-shaped hulls and other things to make our vehicles stronger from being blown up from the bottom. But now the IEDs fly. So now they come from the top. And now they're just not simple homemade weapons, although those will still be applied. They are very sophisticated, getting more expensive, and you have several different types. You have, for instance, you have drones that are just ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So from the top, they will see you and they will call, and people will use that vision to call for fire. So you'll get artillery falling on you because they will see you immediately, and that becomes your forward observer. What a tremendous advantage. The next is a bomber drone, like you just mentioned, a drone that comes over and drops ordnance on you, small or big. It could be a grenade or it could be a mine. And any tank mine has a lot of explosive power, and they can drop those. They can drop RPG rounds. They can drop artillery shells. I mean, the bigger the drone, the more it can carry. The next is a first-person view drone, of course, that can be flown by a pilot, and the pilot is able to see everything the drone sees and flies it right into the target, and the warhead on that can destroy or disable a tank, depending on where they hit. So the next, of course, is loitering munitions, which are higher end kamikaze drones, basically, with much more AI in them. And you can send those loitering munitions out over an area, and they will hover over the area for a period of time, some of them many hours, like the Harop, the Israeli Harop, and the Switchblade. You can have them fly above. And then when they see their target below them, according to their targeting parameters, they drop and destroy it like a kamikaze drone. And then, of course, after that, you have the UCAVs, which are the unmanned combat aerial vehicles. And those are like the Predators and the Reapers and the Bayraktar TB2s that are flown, they're aircraft that are flown by remote pilots. So you have all of those different types, and all of those are top attack. And then you add to that the Javelin, the ballistic missiles, artillery, all those things are top attack. So now we consistently, particularly because of the drones, have to look up. So a question that every tactical leader has to ask is, what do I have to give me early warning for a top attack? And if you have no technology that does this, you better have humans acting as air guards looking. Otherwise, the enemy will hit you and you won't even know it. There was a very sad episode in Gaza just the other day where a Puma APC, armored personnel carrier, with 7 Israeli soldiers was hit by a Hamas terrorist who ran out of a hole and dropped an explosive charge right into the open hatch. So top attack, but right into the hatch, just like you're saying. Now, that was done by a human, but it can be done by a drone. So we have to have a concept that the high ground now that you have to dominate is from the ground up. And that air littoral right above the ground, that has to be dominated if you want to win. And if you can't dominate that, if the enemy dominates it, you're in trouble. So top attack is huge. And then fully autonomous. So what do you know about fully autonomous systems?
Well, we know that there's many platforms out there. Some people have been trying to get it. It's the complexity is around, particularly in the land domain, just because of the fact that there's a lot more objects in the land domain. However, so in air, it's a little bit easier, and sea as well. It's a lot easier to be able to do the target recognition in the sea because there's a lot less different types of categories in there. The land domain is a lot more complicated just because there's humans in there, which they need to be identified what their intentions and affiliations are. And then there's a whole myriad of platforms, civilian and military, and each of those has got to be differentiated. But we're looking at the ability to do that target recognition and then provide autonomous strike capabilities, which gets around the issues of contested EW spectrums. So it's a very interesting area. A lot of militaries are looking at it from different aspects. Critically, it's moving very quickly.
Yeah, very, very true. And good comments. The ability of ground robots, unmanned ground vehicles, to move across terrain and to operate like a human tank crew or a human squad, that is very difficult. We are not at the point where we can create fully autonomous Terminators, as in the movie. But we have the ability now to give fully autonomous capabilities to many weapon systems, as you've already talked about and hinted at, that are both for a period of time. So, for instance, if a human operator starts it off and moves it toward a direction, like a javelin is fired, it's initially human initiated, and then it becomes autonomous after that. And that's the case of almost all weapon systems now. Their period of autonomy was initially short, right before hitting the target, but now that's going to expand. And the farther that it expands, the more it's going to be to the point of turn it on, let it hunt, and then it will kill the target or come back. And that's where we're going to be. Now, we already have fully autonomous weapon systems. There's always a challenge to the ethics of fully autonomous weapon systems, just as there was a problem with the ethics of the crossbow. But nothing stopped the crossbow from being used. And fully autonomous systems, if you do not have fully autonomous systems, when things go beyond the speed of human cognition, you'll be overwhelmed. That's why the Patriot system, for instance, has a fully autonomous mode. That's why the Phalanx, air defense system for ships and the CRAM, which is a air defense Phalanx-like system for fixed sites on the ground, has a completely autonomous mode because it has to fire so fast that humans can't do that. That's why it's so hard, for instance, to shoot down the drone, which is going anywhere between 5 to 60 miles an hour, depending on what kind it is, at you with small arms, unless you have a special small arms sighting system like the Israeli Smash, which basically puts a tank fire control system onto a rifle and allows that rifle to actually adjust automatically for the flying of the drone. So more and more weapon systems will be fully autonomous, and as that happens, they'll be harder to knock down, they'll be harder to jam. And because of all that, we're going to see more and more full autonomy in land, sea, and air, and in space. The next is cognitive electronic warfare. This one was not in my book, Next War. After much thought, I looked at this list and I said, well, how is electronic warfare disrupting warfare today? And it's pretty much, electronic warfare is pretty much the same as it always has been. You jam the enemy's systems. But there's something new coming up that is going to be an absolute disruptor. And it is what I call cognitive electronic warfare. Okay, and that's a fancy name for basically saying AI-enabled EW systems. So imagine right now how we do electronic warfare is very human-centric, just like we do artillery, just like we did many other things. We used to use, like you had a bazooka, okay, in World War II. And that took a human being to do basically the math in their head to fix the aim point in a way that it would hit the target. And the human brain is amazing, just like with an arrow, just like with shooting, but particularly with something that actually doesn't fly quite as straight and fast like a rocket does or an arrow does. The human mind can fix that. Like when you throw a ball, the physics behind being able to throw a ball to another person, that's pretty incredible when you actually think about that. So cognitive electronic warfare is the same kind of thing, only now imagine, right now human beings are very involved in applying the electronic warfare, and they're in there working their systems. They have radars working and things, and soldiers are applying stuff. But imagine if you could just turn it on, and with machine learning and AI, the EW would scan the whole system, the whole spectrum, and apply EW in the right way as needed. And that's where we are. And Anduril, for instance, has a system called Pulsar, and there's other systems out there. And that cognitive electronic warfare, once adopted, is going to be a huge, huge impact in the tactical battle space, in the operational, and maybe even the strategic battle space. Because imagine cognitive electronic warfare on satellites and their ability to jam other satellites either for periods of time or permanently. Take out the enemy's eyes. And that will be one of the main indicators, by the way, of a first strike, is that the enemy will probably do everything they can to take out our ability to see, starting with satellites on down. So cognitive electronic warfare is something that needs to be studied and understood, and we need to apply it fast. And it is something that doesn't take a lot of force structure. It just takes the technology and the money to do it. It does take force structure, of course, but it doesn't take, you're not going to be having to field thousands of soldiers to put cognitive electronic warfare into operation. It could be operated off of drones. It could be operated off of vehicles that already exist, that are already out there doing. You can put it on a tank, for instance. Now it's going to emit. So you're going to have that emission issue in the transparent battle space. Electronic emissions will be seen. And so, for instance, during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, what do you think was the first target the Azerbaijanis went after to try to destroy the Armenian forces?
It would have been their ISR assets. You know, degrade.
Well, yeah. Air defense and ISR, exactly right. So very closely linked because they're tied together, but they tried to destroy as much as possible their air defense, which were linked to radars. So radars first, which were their ISR, because the Armenians had no satellites. The Azerbaijanis did. Interesting. You know, the Azerbaijanis owned 2 of their own satellites and bought satellite data from everybody. So they had satellite information, and they did not have any balloons up. But the whole idea of occupying the stratosphere as a sensor belt and maybe even as an attack belt is something we really need to think through. And the Chinese already have, because if you remember, they had a little tour of America with one of their balloons not too long ago. So that whole concept of being able to take down their ISR and their air defense immediately is what they did, their radars and their shooters. The cognitive electronic warfare is going to be very important to how war will change very soon. Right now, I don't believe there are very few, if any, cognitive electronic warfare systems deployed in any army. But soon, there will be many. And that's all because of artificial intelligence and how an AI-enabled EW system will make a dramatic difference to how things are done.
We'll leave the interview there and return next week for part 2 of the interview. I think the challenge for all of us is to close our eyes, think about what John has discussed, the changes that are occurring today, the impact that it is having on the battlefield today. Close our eyes, use our strategic imagination, and imagine what the future is going to be like. What are the platforms that we're going to need? How are we going to develop the TTPs? And most importantly, how are we going to train our soldiers so that they can use those platforms with the TTPs and prevail on tomorrow's battlefield? After reflecting on everything that John has had to say, I think there's one question to ask. Are the conflicts that we are seeing now going to be our version of the Russo-Japanese War that was fought before the First World War? All of the lessons about combined arms were there on show for all of the observers, and there were observers from all of the main countries. They were there on show for everyone to see, and yet no one actually understood the importance of those lessons. And those lessons, it wasn't just the Russo-Japanese War. Many of the lessons were on show in the US Civil War, 50 years prior to the outbreak of the First World War. Are we going to be able to understand those lessons and understand what it means for the generation of the combined arms effect and for battalions, brigades, divisions in the field, how they're going to conduct themselves, how they're going to fight and win tomorrow's battles?
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by Jane Zeeling. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.